Welcome to week 4 of Biblical Worldview 1. This is part 2 of our discussion on sin and its consequences, taken from Genesis 3 through chapter 11. And just by way of quick review, if you'll go back and note the first two responses, the first two incidences, the first sinful response, of course, was Adam and Eve's rebellion against God, the boundaries that he had set forth in the garden. And I wish we had an opportunity to develop this a little bit further and talk about boundaries in general, but especially when it comes to living a life that is a reflection of this worldview that God is setting forth. And Adam and Eve just made the choice to not do that. And so consequently, the results of that poor choice results in them having to leave the garden. And as a result, they're pushed further away from God and ultimately, of course, are destined for physical death. They leave the garden, they begin to bring children into the world, and that prompts the second incident involving two of Adam and Eve's children, their first two sons, Cain and Abel, and both brought sacrifices to the Lord, and not because of what they offered, but how they offered it. If you'll read closely in the text, God accepted Abel's offering over his older brothers. Cain, in his jealousy and anger, uh, kills his younger brother. And now, in addition to all the first that we have in the book of Genesis, we have the first murder, the first incident of how you do not treat a human, how human life is to be respected and treasured. And obviously, Cain just completely uh, destroys that. Well, what's the consequence? Well, Cain is driven even further away from God, and that, as I said in part 1, this is the pattern that with each four of these incidences in chapters 3 through 11. And so those are the first two, and you can go back and listen to part 1 if that helps. But we're ready for the third incident, and that, of course, is the fact that human society chooses wickedness as the norm for human behavior. And as the human population grows, the emerging societies that we read about in the sixth chapter of the book of Genesis kind of is symptomatic. In fact, verse 5 of chapter 6 reads, "The Lord God saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. And the Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled." And if you look back there at verse 5, that that phrase, every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. Now I know we live in a difficult world. I know that there's a lot of evil, there's a lot of wickedness, there's a lot of violence, but I don't think that we have risen to the level of where the world was at this time. Despite the evil that's out there, there is still good. There are still incidents and examples of goodness in the lives of people, and I choose to camp out on that, if you will. A lot of times, and we touched on this last week, when the discussion centers around whether or not God exists, one of the challenges is, well, then how do you explain all the suffering and all the evil in the world? If God is all powerful, how do you explain evil? Well, and it's a valid question, and hopefully, if we're together in the course on Christian ethics, we can address that a little bit further. But while we're addressing the question of where does evil come from, let's look at the other side. Where does goodness come from? How would you explain the good things that people do? And so, that had no longer become the norm. That was the exception, and consequently, because of a low regard for human life, then there you have it. Verse 5, chapter 6. Every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. And so God has to uh, deal with this. Verse 5, I will wipe out excuse me, verse 6 and 7. I will wipe from the face of the earth in the human race I've created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I've made them. And so this wickedness prompts God to just basically wipe the slate clean and start over. Remember back in Genesis 1, the phrase repeated over and over in reference to creation was that God saw that it was good. In Genesis chapter 1, that's in verse 4, verse 10, verse 12, verse 18, verse 21, verse 25, and verse 31. Now, in contrast, God sees how great the wickedness of the human race had become. The world is not so good anymore. And so God decides to destroy uh, uh, creation and start over. And the next 4 chapters, Genesis 6 through 9, describes in great detail the universal flood that God sends. And I think it's important to read this against Genesis 1, for the flood is described in terms that depict it as a reversal of the creation in Genesis 1. In Genesis 1, the waters above and waters below are separated. And now they collapse together in this great flood. Chapter 7, verse 11 of Genesis. Uh, you know, verse 9 of chapter 1, God commanded the dry ground to appear. And now, verses 17 through 20 of chapter 7, it's reversed. And the ground is covered with water. And most of the life created in Genesis 1 is now destroyed. But in the midst of all this, God preserves one man and his wife, their 3 sons and their wives. Noah and his wife and their 3 sons and their wives are going to, along with the representative animals, are placed in that ark. And in essence, the world is recreated as the waters separate, and the animals and people once again, of course, will re-inhabit a new earth. And so this flood comes, and you read this in the narrative, and the waters rose and increased greatly on the earth. And the ark floated on the surface of the water, and they rose greatly on the earth, and all the high mountains of the entire heavens were covered. In fact, you read closely in the narrative, the highest point in all the world was under 15 feet of water. Now, again, this is not a class on Christian apologetics or Christian evidences. We could get into a discussion on, the effects of whether or not this was an actual universal flood or was it a regional one, and we don't have the opportunity to delve into that right now. But go back to what we discussed in the first week. If you approach this, a study of Scripture and deny the supernatural, deny the miraculous, then consequently you're going to have to, discount this. But to do that, you have to rewrite or explain away some very, very uh, uh, explicit directives and explicit, I would even say, evidence that the fact that it did happen. So, what were the consequences? Well, here again, the waters rose, and I mentioned this a while ago. And by the way, it rained for 40 days and for 40 nights. But Noah and his family and all those representative animals are going to be on the ark for over a year. And if you have an opportunity, I would encourage you. In fact, many of you may have been to the Ark exhibit up in Kentucky. But if you have a chance, you could go to on YouTube and look and take a virtual tour of the Ark exhibit, and that might not convince you of the validity of this incident, but it would at least, I think it at least would give you reason to pause and say, well, it could have happened, and it could have happened that way. And you might do that in in some of your spare time that I know you have plenty of right now. And we see all the aspects of this, and consequently, Noah and his family are uh, the nucleus to start human life over again on the earth. Well, you turn to chapter 11 in here again, still in the book of Genesis, and we come across this fourth incident. Unfortunately, Noah's descendants do not remain faithful to God for very long, and as a result, they reject the reality that they were created in God's image, and and by the way, because we're created in His image, we are integrally connected to God. But to the contrary, you read in the narrative, they desired to be independent of God and to make their own name by which they could be identified. And there are so many modern day implications for this. We don't have time to delve into them, but they decide that they want to build a tower. Verse 4 of chapter 11. Let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Doesn't that sound familiar? Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth. And so that's what they want to do. And they want to they want to build something for themselves without God. Well, what was the consequence? Well, again, read in the narrative, God is offended by that, and he confuses the language of the people, and the construction on this tower ends. And that prompts even more so the scattering of humanity throughout that part of the world. And again, you can read this, and so consequently, they were scattered. Verses 8 and 9, they were scattered from where they were, and that's why to that at the time of the writing it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world from where the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. It's a rather interesting incident for sure. Well, what do we learn from this? Well, Genesis 3 through 11 deals primarily with sin, rebellion, and its consequences. Separation from the presence of God, separation between people and God, scattering, and ultimately death. But sprinkled faintly across this section are also glimpses of hope. Those short verses that imply something beyond the judgment and the dire consequences. And we see this. There's judgment on the serpent back in chapter 3 and verse 15. People began to call on the name of the Lord, chapter 4 and verse 26. And then we see the salvation of Noah and his family in in chapters 6 through chapter 9. And so, we have that to kind of hang our hat on. Well, what do we need to apply from this? Well, first, since God is creator, we know who to worship. We know who is the object of our affections and of our relationship. Secondly, God desires his creation to have that close fellowship with him. Even though that relationship was altered in the garden, God puts into motion the means by which that relationship will ultimately be restored, and it will be restored because of the willingness on the part of God's Son to come and live and die for humanity, so that that relationship might be restored. And then finally, human sin is the author of pain and suffering in the world. I asked a while ago, well, where do people want to know? Well, why is there suffering in the world? Not because God is not powerful enough, but it's because of human error and human rebellion and defiance. We started with this whole concept of in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And I would invite you to take that verse. We began with it a week ago, really, as somewhat of a memory verse. And once we come to realize and accept that God is the creator and ruler of the universe, and not us, by the way, then much of the confusion in life can be cleared up. And we know who is worthy to be worshiped. We know who has the power and the authority to set the standards for living, and we can understand that God, as creator of the universe, is involved in the world and in human history.